I didn't care. And kind of the attitude in restaurants is if you can show up and do the work, you're fine. So it didn't matter how hungover I was. I had normalized hangovers so that when withdrawals came, it was like, oh, this is just a bad hangover. I need to drink more. So This is a bad hangover. No big deal. I preferred being hungover to just dealing with life sober. That, like, to me, hangovers were better than being around family members.
Hey all, what's going on? Welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast, where we highlight underrepresented journeys of sobriety from within Black and Brown communities. I'm really excited today because I think that the guests that we have, there's some overlaps and some similarities in that I've spent a significant amount of my professional career working in the world of hospitality and restaurants and hotels. And for anyone who's spent any time, whether it be in the kitchen, in the back of the house, in the front of the house of a restaurant, in an operation of a hotel, you know that it's kind of rife for alcohol consumption at a bare minimum. And there's a bunch of other stuff in the industry as well. So I feel like we've probably seen a lot of the same things, even though we've worked in different cities and probably for different organizations. But looking forward to getting into the conversation. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you Andry Rakotoniaina to the Stack of Days podcast. Andry, welcome to the show.
Ray, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
You got it. And hopefully I didn't butcher your last name. It's extremely challenging to get these things right sometimes.
And you took the challenge on point.
Thank good. You. Cool. Awesome. Well, look, Andry, let's get into it. Let's go back to the beginning of your relationship with alcohol. Let's talk a little bit about the why, how it came to be, and we'll kind of just take it from there and move through chronologically until you've reached your sobriety.
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of funny for me to talk about addiction in particular because like where addiction comes in might be a little bit different from where alcohol comes in. And alcohol is certainly my drug of choice. So it's easy to say alcohol came into my life on an afternoon at a friend's basement. And it was a hot Corona. Like, that's memorable, right? And it was terrible. It was not it was not a good first drink. By any means. It was memorable in how terrible it was. And I had a sip and it was done. And it was like, oh, I guess we'll have more eventually. And then that was in high school. I don't know, maybe sophomore year. And then it turned into after school hangouts at a friend's house with screwdrivers and getting toasty and smoking up some and in Kentucky it's still not legal to smoke, but there's plenty of alcohol, so that was pretty readily available. Both were, but in any case, the use of alcohol was something that the consumption of it and the overconsumption of it came in really easy for me, really fast. If I could pay attention, if I retrospectively could look at previous times where anything I've done has been just overdone, alcohol absolutely falls in suit. So chocolate is a big thing for me. People have made fun of me for years for eating way too many Kit Kats, way too many cookies. Alcohol was like instant. I was also one of those kids that would sneak into the kitchen and eat cake. And then mom would be like, "Why is there only half a cake left?" That was me. So,
I don't know.
I don't know. The Halloween candy, I would eat all my siblings' candy. So alcohol was like instant. I feel like the overconsumption was something I reached for immediately. Like, the effect was something that was worth the horrible taste. I remember the first weekend we had a party, and I felt so hungover. I remember like cleaning up after the party or trying to get my stuff in order, and I was like, I can't wait till we do this again. Like, I feel terrible and I can't wait. Like, this is going to be good. That was I don't know, sophomore or junior year, somewhere around there in high school.
I feel like the cakes, the candies, I mean, this is kind of alluding to like your behavior of like wanting to like consume, right? And I think that alcohol, as we all know, is a really dangerous substance when we're of that kind of mindset, where we want to consume. Because as we were talking before the show, at least for me, it was certainly a slippery slope. Um, at what point in time well, first of all, before you even get into that, when you were kind of being, stepping into like this euphoria of the alcohol, what did that do for you? What was kind of like the why behind why that felt so great for you?
Um, I love that you said euphoria because that's the exact word that comes to mind for me too. Um, every sip
Mm,
was a euphoric hit. Um, and it's so alluring in how that hit of joy or manufactured joy comes into my brain, my mentality. Um, and it just felt like the more I'd sip, the more I'd feel good. And pretty quickly, I mean, for a rookie drinker, there's that level where things aren't remembered anymore and blackout happens and like I would consume past that point. Um, because it
mm,
just felt so good. And I think it would be easier to say that there were a lot of things going on in my life at that point as a high schooler that were just stressful. And I think a lot of people say, "Oh, high school kind of sucks," but like my home life was not great. As hard as my parents worked for it, my home life didn't feel great for me. Um,
mm,
and it didn't feel like I had a voice in much of anything. It felt like my parents had a lot of choice over a lot of things. And I was working too. I was working two
mhm.
jobs and going to school and managing extracurriculars. And both my jobs were in restaurants at that point too. Um, so
Okay.
it felt like a lot of my time was given away to other people. So me drinking was a way of reclaiming my time for me, um, which sounds ironic because there's a lot of time that goes into recovering from drinking, and that just bleeds into everything else.
Yeah. How did your relationship internally with your family? I mean, you're a junior, you're a senior in high school, and obviously you're doing some very grown things and working two jobs and trying to live your life and get some empowerment back. Uh, But I'm assuming you're still also very deeply intertwined and connected back into your family. How did they kind of reconcile this kind of this life that you were living at the time, or was it something that they weren't really privy to?
They weren't my family wasn't really privy to any of this. To kind of lay the background, I'm a second generation immigrant. Both of my parents are from a country in Africa, out in the Indian Ocean. So the
Okay.
idea that I would be doing anything other than school or work was pretty much out of the question. I had a really tight curfew.
Okay.
I had expectations laid out for me that I was either studying, I was in school, or I was at work, or I was playing tennis, or I was doing academic team
Okay.
or whatever. So like my schedule was pretty rigid, and I had expectations that I needed to be at certain places at certain times. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I had I have three younger siblings, um, and both my mom and dad were present in my life at the time, and um, so those expectations to be there for my siblings were there, work obligations, school obligations, extracurriculars. Um, so I made it my job, my third job, to lie, uh, to keep my
Mm,
substances within close range. Um, my friends were also assigned to me. So by my parents, they were really strict about who I could see, and it turned out that those friends were pretty good at knowing where parties were and where the substances were. So that worked to my advantage. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, it was I don't see how I did it looking back because it was a lot of lying to manage my time, and to manage to be in the right places at the right times and to do all those things. Um,
Mm,
and on top of that, like one of the difficulties I was facing family wise was sometime during my high school experience, my dad fell ill, and he was the only one that was driving, and he eventually got diagnosed with cancer. And so I was also driving my dad to treatment, my siblings to school, my mom to and from work. and taking myself to work. So managing to fit
Well,
using in all of that and still be at places at certain times inevitably meant that I was prioritizing being drunk um, over being present. Over being present mentally. Like I could be present physically and I would be drunk.
yeah.
And I one thing I learned was to stay present and not look like I was drunk. Uh, it became second nature really quickly, really easily.
Yeah. I can I can empathize with that for sure. And just how you kind of step and fall into this behavior of managing things really like naturally. It's not one of those things where you sit down and you're entirely intentional about how you're going to come in and out of these spaces and how are you going to manage perceptions and so on and so forth. Like I only recognized in retrospect how tight the ship was, so to speak. Until it wasn't, but how tight the ship was, completely, on autopilot. I mean, it seems effortless, but we all know that tons of effort actually went into it and energy. And it also sounds like for you, you were just under a huge degree of like pressure. You're the eldest of all your siblings. It sounds like, right?
Right, right. Eldest of four. Yep. And you're right.
Gotcha.
The level
Um,
of work and management that it takes to be present in all these different arenas, it's so much effort, and it's mind-boggling how the kind of juggling it takes to justify that too. It's not fair to anybody.
yeah. Were the friends that you were hanging out with at the time? I mean, I know they were great at finding parties, but were they also kind of living that same life where everyone was basically just drunk all the time, so it didn't seem as though that there was any issue really?
Yeah, we were a group of really, I guess, privileged kids in that we were really smart. So we could show up to
Hmm.
practices or wherever, and like it was not really much of an effort. Um, and yeah, so we were smart kids who had a lot of leeway.
Gotcha. I mean, were they also of immigrant families? Your friend core?
One was, and then the other couple friends in my group were, uh, I guess, shining all American examples. In my high school, I was one of, I don't know, one of five maybe people of color in my smaller
Mm,
city Catholic high school, and yeah, I I was definitely a unique person in the whole makeup of the school, and I guess those five people, three of those would be my siblings, so or one of those would be my
there you go.
siblings, but the yeah, it was an overwhelmingly majority white city and majority white high school for sure. So it was very
Yeah.
easy to be the minority there, and I don't even want to say what my nickname was, but uh, it's probably the opposite of what you think.
Okay. I don't want to ask you to share if you're not open
I'll
to it.
say it. I'll
So
say it. I'm
I'll
happy
leave.
to.
Well, well, please share.
Yeah,
It's
and
a safe space.
yeah, so I was growing up. I was the whitest black kid anybody had met, right? That was the going.
Yeah.
That was kind of the going rate. So growing up, the derogatory term Oreo was often used, um, and like I wasn't allowed to sit at certain tables, and it was just rough. And then at this school,
Yeah.
like I made friends pretty easily. I'd learned to do that because we moved around a lot. Um, and my name at high school was Cracker, uh, because I was the whitest black kid anybody knew, and the it was a name
Wow.
given in love and in irony, but also like looking back, I don't think I know I wouldn't tolerate that now. It's just
Yeah.
it's what's the word? It's reduction. It's reductive. It's really reductive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, at the time, like that's such a compromise, right? To be able to like fit in and not like cause any waves. And to your point, like in retrospect, you look back and you're like, man, they just that was a real jab, you know what I mean, at my identity, and I took it. But I think again, it just kind of speaks to the positioning that you're in. Like, what are your options, right? Like, I wouldn't fault you, as a kid in high school, just trying to like fit in, probably more than anything else.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough balance to not want to make any waves, and then just by default, by existing and making waves. It's an isolating
Yeah.
place to be, for sure. So reaching for substances
Yeah.
and reaching for the friends that I had seemed like an obvious yes. Like, why wouldn't I want to escape just life and every day? And one thing I forgot to mention was I freshman year for me was 2001. So 9/11 happened
Hmm.
in my freshman year, and the homeland when this homeland security thing started becoming a thing, and their whole rhetoric around like pushing immigrants out and like chasing, uh, it like brown people were not looked at with favor in 2001, 2002,
Yeah.
2003. And I remember being so fearful that I would be deported or that my family would be deported. It was a real fear. Um,
Hmm.
and it's really hard. It was really hard to find anybody that could possibly relate in a positive way. It just was. So like feeling like people were looking at me in the worst way was a very real thing.
Yeah. I feel like have had the fortune of speaking to a handful of folks on this platform, and so often, time and time again, you hear stories of folks who just feel alienated in their own communities as kids. You know what I mean? And the degree of like strife that puts on an individual, and to pair that with just other life struggles, challenges, tensions, it almost makes it ripe for someone wanting to escape, right? So like you can't even fault the individual who's trying to get away from the just like the incessant pain, I feel like, that some folks are constantly coming up against. So I hear you, and I certainly feel you, from that standpoint. When did you start getting to a point where it started to escalate for you potentially, and maybe becoming a little bit more problematic than just a euphoric, kind of voyage out of your everyday kind of life?
Yeah, I think the scary thing is that the euphoria never really left for me. I know a lot of
Mhm.
people do say that the euphoria left for them, and I feel kind of unfortunate in that as long as I kept on drinking, that euphoria was there. The downsides became pretty apparent actually kind of quickly. I mean, um,
Okay.
when I was hungover, it was hard for me to wake up. I mean, I would wake up still drunk. Um, and my family members still had places to be, so I had to drive them to places, and that certainly was not something that my mother approved of. My dad eventually passed away from complications of cancer when I was 21 or 22, and by then I was deeper in it than ever,
Hmm.
and I had completely resolved myself to stick around for my siblings and work as much as I could in restaurants and party as much as I could because that's still what I deserved. Um, it's funny how that logic worked out. I was like, okay, I'll just put school aside. I'll put college aside. I wasn't really doing well at it anyway, so I was like, that's an easy thing to give up. Um,
Gotcha.
and part of the manifestation of my drinking was that I was drinking instead of going to class. And what actually started how that started was I remember I'd wake up, I'd drop off my siblings at school, my mom at work. I had class at like 9 o'clock, so I had time to go home, crack open a bottle of whiskey, and watch the sun to continue to rise, write a paper, and then go to class. And then eventually I just stopped going to class and I kept on drinking. And that's
Mm.
it appeared pretty immediately. So giving up school just for work and drinking was pretty easy because I was good at my job. I eventually
Hmm.
took up a serving. I was started off as a host at age 15, so by age 22, I was already a key holder at a retail job and a server or bar server at that time at different restaurants or a bar. Um, and yeah, I managed to not get in trouble at work because I took that seriously. Like I took my presence at work more seriously than I took my presence anywhere outside of work. Um, but
Hmm.
yeah, I managed to stay drinking and keep on working my way up in restaurants um, pretty easily through like age 26 or 27. I got a management job at a restaurant full time, and I had a girlfriend, and um, it was a fun restaurant to work in because uh, parties could be easily found, super easy, like just upstairs
Yeah.
in the owner's apartment after work. And
Right.
but uh, I guess it's not I know, I don't have to guess. I know, and I knew then that it wasn't a smart idea for a manager to party with subordinates. It's just poor form. It opens up a whole door to bad, uh, bad opportunities for misrepresenting myself or
Yep.
behaving poorly. And so I tried to avoid it, but inevitably I would show up, and even my coworkers would know, like, don't let Andry drink too much and do this or do that. He has to be at work in the morning. So
Right.
having
Right.
coworkers like say that out loud kind of in kept me aware of like the stakes of my behavior. So I learned to drink at home. I learned to drink by myself instead of with coworkers, and because that was more acceptable than going out and misbehaving. Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, I would say around age 26, 27. Um, I mean, at that time, if you look at the time, it was 10 years of drinking, um, 10 years of
Yeah.
solid drinking. And it used to be at Tuesdays in that year, I would be drunk and wake up and pass out. I would be passing out and waking up like 3 or 4 times on a Tuesday. So by the time
Yeah.
6 p.m. rolls around, my friends who have normal jobs, because I would be off on
They're
Tuesdays,
coming
so my
home.
friends who had normal jobs would be clocking out and meeting up for drinks, and I'd be like, okay, cool. And in reality, I would have been sick several times, and then take a shower, clean myself up, be presentable, and then go out. And like to everybody else, they're just having like 2 or 3 drinks and then going home. But for me, that was rally number 3 or 4 for the day, and I would be it was absurd. I would have like I would rally up for 6 o'clock drinks and then make my appearances at like 2 or 3 other places. So by the time midnight rolls around, I've been over consuming for hours, just hours. And that was Tuesday. Like I was still drinking on the other days.
I
So
was going to say Wednesday morning must have been extremely rough for you, or at whatever point in time you got up on Wednesdays.
and that's also kind of the unfortunate thing for me was I didn't care. And kind of the attitude in restaurants is if you can show up and do the work, you're fine. So it didn't matter how hungover I was, I'd be fine.
Yeah.
Um, but I had grown so used to being sick, like just throwing up, puking all the time. Like it
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah.
I wouldn't throw up so much the next day, but during the act of drinking, I would throw up all the time because I was drinking so much. That the next day, hungover, I had accepted that hangovers were the price of entry for my consumption. Like it was a normal thing for me. So hangovers were just it was basics. It was just a fact of life, and it's actually pretty scary when because I had normalized hangovers, so that when withdrawals came, it was like, oh, this is just a bad hangover. I need to drink more, so this
Right.
is a bad hangover. No big deal.
Yeah. It's interesting how like even in those like when you're just like physically just depleted and trying to come back from a hangover, it's just another thing to manage, right? Like you know that there's a pain threshold that you're trying to manage, and it will turn at some point. If it doesn't turn, then you have a little, a little hair of the dog that, that may help. As painful as some hangovers are, and for folks out there who've experienced their fair share, like we all know how bad they can get, but we keep coming back for more. And I think that that's the basis of like some of the addiction is like even in the face of pain, physical anguish and pain, where sometimes you literally feel like you're going to die, you still keep coming back for more.
Agreed. And the other thing was too, I preferred being hungover to just dealing with life sober. That, like, to me, hangovers were better than being around family members. And my family members weren't even bad. It was just
Mm,
it seemed like everything to me was an uphill battle. So if I'm gonna deal with that anyway and hate it when I'm sober, I might as well be hungover and not really care about it at all. And
yeah.
that's pretty
Yeah.
alarming looking back.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, we'd really love it if you could leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. And of course, please feel free to invite somebody into the conversation. If you feel like you have a story to share on the podcast, why not apply to be a guest? You can do so by completing the form on the podcast description or find it on stackanddays.com. That's stacknday's.com. But for now, let's jump back into the conversation. That is alarming to hear, even, right? Like, having been through my own fair share of like rough ass hangovers, to know that that is almost better than just dealing with what's at hand on a day to day. I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't get it, because I do. But that is a pretty desperate state of affairs for sure. So talk to me then, Andrew. Like, what does that look like then? So you're in a managerial role. You're working in the space of your choosing, right? Um, and you're highly functioning. You figured out how to kind of work the system so you can do what you need to do and still show up the way that you need to show up. What was kind of the what was kind of like the road to some sort of recognition for you that you had to do some things differently, or is there still more time to be had before we get there? Because I
Um,
feel like you're now at a place where you're having some moments, but not quite at a place where you're saying, let me just I'm ready to like make a change,
yeah, yeah, close.
or I'm even capable of making a change.
Exactly, exactly. I was so close. I was so close. But I was still very far away. Um, like I
Mhm.
could my coworkers at different jobs. Like I had a coworker, my boss at my retail job was sober. Um, my UPS driver at that retail job, the UPS driver of a UPS job was sober, and we had talked about it. Um, and I
I was gonna say, how does that even come up?
I mean, he knew I was wearing beer swag all the time. Like I was wearing my branded retail swag, and it was it
Okay.
was like it was not in the alcohol business. And I was always talking about brewing beer. Like I was a beer nerd. And
Okay.
that was genuinely how I was trying to connect with everybody. I was like, "Do you drink beer? Do you like IPAs? Do you like stouts? What's your jam?" And I genuinely thought that
Hmm.
if you weren't drinking, then what am I to you? What are you to me? That was how I related
Right.
to people. Um, and through conversation, I found out that my GM was sober. I found out that my UPS driver was sober, and it was a small enough town of like 60,000 people that you kind of know everybody through the grapevine. And
Mm.
I'm guessing they kind of saw my behavior and because I showing up hungover to a retail job, talking to the general public. Um, I was smelling like alcohol on some days, like pretty clearly. Um,
Yeah.
and it my irresponsibility showed up definitely. I didn't get fired from that job or from any job for my overconsumption, but I definitely got like write-ups for being late, um, or like I had another manager noticed that I absolutely reeked of tequila one day, and we were selling retail to children and families, so it's not a good look. But
Yeah.
all that to say, at that restaurant job in 2014, I had one chef that was sober. The executive chef at one time was sober. He's still sober now. There was a sous chef that was sober, and I remember us talking, and I was like, "How are you? How are you sober and enjoying yourself? Like that doesn't seem enjoyable at all."
Mm.
And they were like, yeah, well,
Yeah.
I just don't like a substance controlling me. And I was like, oh, well, I'm in control of my substances, so I'm good. Because even at this point, I was a beverage manager. So I was in charge of the wine
Okay.
program. I was in charge of training. I was in charge. I was helping out with
Super
schedules.
appropriate.
Super appropriate. So um, really just, and I was like, I was responsible. I would show up for work. And coworkers could rely on me. Um, Vendors could rely on me. So to me, I was like, I'm so functional. Like I'm better than I've ever been. And in reality, I
Hmm.
was drinking so much. Um, it was just not. And again, in retrospect, it's so much easier to see. But I was drinking so much that there was no way I could be accountable for my own actions. I didn't think I was accountable for my own actions. And the way I
Hmm.
acted, I certainly didn't care about the restaurant or the people I was with, but I could act like I did. Because that's
Right.
part of the being a professional is being very presentable, being very welcoming. And because I'd had all that training for 10 years, I was like, oh, I'm good. I can be at
Yeah.
places and be drunk, and that's fine. So it was easy to hide in plain sight. Um, and really, part of the beginning of the end of my drinking career, that was 2014. I left that job. My relationship eventually with that girlfriend just crashed and burned completely because of my lack of honesty. Like the lies I'd started when I was 17 continued up until I was 27. And I would lie about where I was supposed to be, lie about how much I was drinking. Um, it was easy to hide because we were living in different cities. And it was when push came to shove, I got the ultimatum like, you need to stop drinking or this relationship is going to end. And my foolhardy response was, "This relationship isn't going to end because of drinking. It's ending because I'm leaving. It's over when I say it's over." And then I
Yeah.
promptly
Okay.
sat down and cried. I was like, "Why can't I give up drinking? Like why? Like right there and right then and there, I was like, why can't I give up drinking?" So I knew that was a
Mm.
problem. Um, the euphoria, like I said, was very presentable. It was there always, even when I knew it was bad for me. It was so accessible, um,
Hmm.
and yeah, that relationship ended. And I remember talking to friends, and they were like, "Yeah, maybe you should move out of this small town." Um, I'm in right now. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, but back then I was in a smaller town, a little bit western down the river. And I was like, okay, cool. Maybe I need to get out of here. I'll move to Louisville.
Hmm.
Um, And I kind of laugh now because I remember hearing, even then, I remember hearing of people that moved to Louisville from my hometown and getting way too caught up in the party scene. And I was thinking to myself,
Yeah.
surely I'll get sober in Louisville. Surely that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's
The classic relocation technique.
exactly. It works every time, guaranteed. But no,
Yeah.
no, I took about it such a boneheaded way. I took about it to moving to Louisville such a boneheaded way. I found a job at a brewery, and because obviously that's what I know to do. I love beer. Of course, being in a brewery environment is going to be good for me. Like we didn't have any hard liquor at that brewery. Um,
Mm.
it was a nice homey feel in a good part of town. So I took up the job. It was 2 nights a week. I was like, cool. So I was commuting 2 hours one way to this job for a job one, maybe two shifts a week. And it's it was not a smooth transition. I was like, okay, well, cool. I'll just find a place to stay in Louisville. And like I had friends in Louisville, but not reliable friends, and I wasn't reliable. Like I just wasn't a reliable person. Um,
Hmm.
so I found ways to sleep in my car at truck stops because I would get off work at like midnight and I don't want to drive 2 hours on down the interstate to come home. So I would stay at a truck stop and sleep. And I eventually like I made my way around town and I found other bars I could drink in through networks of bartenders and like not pay anything. I thought it was so cool. And that was my bigger priority over finding a place to sleep. Um, and then uh, I found the liquor stores that had the clearance deals, so I could buy nice craft beer clearance cases. And I had
Hmm.
growlers rolling around in my trunk. So I had cases of beer in my trunk, growlers of beer, a 5 pound jar of peanut butter, and I was sleeping at truck stops. And I was like, "This is cool. This is a pretty cool life I'm living, man." Um,
Mm.
and like I prioritize drinking over food, which is just wild to think about too. Um,
Yeah.
and I eventually I found a friend loaned me a spare room, and I stayed at their place for probably way too long. And then one of their friends, we met and became roommates, and I signed a lease in 2016. And then at that point, I'd been at that brewery job for a year. Um, and I had an opportunity pop up at a high volume bourbon bar, whiskey bar in a different part of town, um, actually really close to where my roommate and I were going to live. Um, so I took that opportunity up. It was my first like salaried job in
Mm.
2016, and uh, I was like, cool, I finally made it. Like I have a place I can sleep in. I have a good roommate. I've got a car, and now I've got this job. So like things are definitely looking up. And I was drinking the whole time, so I was like, surely if I did this while drinking, then I'll be able to make it. And the truth is, I've been trying to stop drinking the whole time. I even at the
Hmm.
brewery, I knew I had a problem. So I was like, okay, I'll obviously I want to keep my job, so I'm not going to drink at work. Like not too much. I was allowed to drink at work. Just don't make a fool of yourself. So
Right.
so I was fine. And then I ran into the problem of, well, these beers, I don't know the names of them, I don't know the descriptions, so I felt obligated to taste. So 2 ounces here, over and over, and eventually over the course of a shift, I've had a pint, and I felt guilty for having a pint, like spaced out over like
Mm.
4 hours or 6 hours. I was like, if this is what stopping drinking is like, it's torture for me to stop at a pint. Like this isn't fun. Um, and I had found the community on Reddit, Stop Drinking, and they're like, well, if you're having 16 ounces of beer, that's not really stopping drinking. And I'm like, I guess you're right. I guess I have to stop drinking, like because I might as well keep on going if I can't even be honest. So
Yeah.
that was a real challenge, finding a way to keep stopped drinking when there are samples in front of me. And I mean,
So tough, man.
I was pretty successful in managing my consumption. It just sucked. It was no fun.
Yeah.
It just was. It felt like torture. It felt like work to stay sober, or to stay like slightly less than inebriated. Um, and yeah, that job, that opportunity came up at the whiskey bar, and there was so much hard liquor there, and it was a pretty big step up in terms of volume. It was a pretty big, like a busy set.
I mean, it, can I just ask, like, in your mind, moving over to this whiskey bar, like, how did you rationalize that for yourself? Because I know, like, at least for myself, in hindsight, like, I've similar to you, had responsibilities like managing, liquor and wine inventories and all, and I feel like I probably would have rationalized it at the time, but now looking back, I know that if I were to make that move, it probably wouldn't have been the right move for me, right? How were you rationalizing at the time that making that step into this like high end like bourbon slash whiskey bar was going to be a good move for you, considering that you were having such a hard time even just moderating, at the at the brewery.
Oh, it was easy rationalization. Um, and again, so that brewery job, um, it was 2 days a week, sometimes three if I was lucky. Usually one day a
Okay.
week. And over time, I was able to save up money, but it was pretty clear that if I wanted to have any stability, which is what I always craved, was stability, um,
Yep.
I needed to have
I
a
get that.
full-time job, and that's what this gig offered. It was full-time, salaried benefits, which is kind of rare to find um, in in the hospitality. So, like paid vacation time, that's awesome. Um, so yeah, and damn it, I'm good at selling. So I mean, why can't I sell if I can sell beer? Why can't I sell all the whiskeys, all the bourbon, all the rye? Like, why not? Wine not is what I used to say because that's how tacky I was. Um, so yeah, yeah. It was I was really good at it, and I wanted to eventually become a master distiller. I hadn't worked out how I was going to do that
Okay.
sober, but I was going to do that. Um, Spoiler: I'm not a master distiller, but um,
Okay.
the uh, the the whole idea was my skill set was pretty unique. I was good at tasting. I was good at making notes. I was good at training people. I was good at being around people. So like all the arrows pointed, go work in a restaurant, do management, because that's where my skill set led me. And it it didn't fail me. But being in that environment was also like priming the pump for my addiction, without a doubt. Without a doubt. More
Hmm.
stress,
Hmm.
more hours, more of everything.
Did you recognize in the moment that it was kind of priming that pump for you, or is that more of a retrospective? I feel like it's obvious to someone looking from the outside in that that would probably be the case, but what were you thinking at the time, other than the fact that like this is me on a career trajectory that makes total sense, and I think for the average person who can handle this environment, it's probably a great place to be, right? Because I hear you, the salary, the benefits, the paid time, like all those things are don't come to folks who are in this space. So in some ways, it's like it's an arrival moment, right? But in the back of your mind, you're like, gosh, the proximity that I have right now to all of these fine whiskeys is probably very dangerous. So I don't know if that was something that you were thinking about at the time.
So yeah, it was very apparent from the day I got hired. Because I got hired Derby season of 2016, which is right around yeah, right around May. And
Okay.
alongside me as a hire in front of house, um, they hired two servers, one woman who was sober, who I eventually found out was sober, and then um, one gentleman, one guy about my age, and me. So it was what made us similar, what made us different was I was a very active drinker. I At this point I was still full on in it, and I thought I was managing myself
Hmm.
pretty well. Um, and then eventually we find out this guy that also got hired was something wasn't quite right, something was a little bit off. And then I was off one day, and the next day he was fired. And it turned out he was nodding off while taking an order at a table, just nodding off.
Jeez.
So he had to be let go. So I was like, oh, cool. So like, there's a clearly not functional person who had to be let go. There's me who's functional and drinking, and then there's the sober person. I was like, wow, we have full spectrum of addiction going on here.
Yeah.
And I was like, cool.
Sure. Yeah.
I wonder how long this is going to last. Um, and that you could say when I had that job, I was on my best behavior in that like honeymoon period as I was a new hire, and I was. Um, I remember I was basically the only manager on duty the first 2 weeks or a month that I was there because the GM left, and then the next manager up had a vacation they had planned a year for, so it was me and the
Hmm.
chef. Um, and over time, I had accept like I knew the whole point of me moving to Louisville was to straighten my life out and find stability. Um, and I had started to eventually like count my drinks. I used an app. I was counting my drinks. I was like, okay, like maybe if I count, then I can stop at a certain time. Um,
Hmm.
and that never really happened. what I would do is I would count when I was drinking, and then I would stop drinking and try to stay stopped. And that would last for like maybe 12 hours, or that could last for 24 hours, or it could last for 48 hours. And I didn't have any support whatsoever. I didn't feel the need to reach out for
Yeah.
support. I just continued to dabble with dry time without drinking. And there was never a good time, to me, to my mind, there was never a good time to stop drinking because there was always a new product coming out that I had to represent on the shelf. There was always a new beer release. There was always a festival. Like, we basically have weekly festivals from May or April, late April through October here. And so there was always a festival. There was always an occasion to, like, a birthday party. There was always a new restaurant opening up to celebrate. There was always a new bar opening, or there was a bar closing, or there was a funeral to go to, or a wedding. So there was never a good time for me to get sober.
Always an excuse.
Exactly, exactly. And yeah, it was. Somehow I managed to get like 2 months sober, and then I would drink again, and I would get another month sober, and then drink again, and it kept on happening. And I guess flash forward to like 2017. Yeah, 2017, and the sober woman that I got hired alongside with had noticed because I was checking her out at the end of the night, checking her slips, making sure she was getting paid, and she noticed like I
Hmm.
was entering drinks and like my phone was open, and she's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm counting my drinks, trying to stop drinking." She was like, "Well,
Mm.
how much are you drinking?" I'm like, "Well, right now, I guess on average like 200 something drinks a week." And she's like, that doesn't sound like you're succeeding." And I was like, "Yeah,
Right.
it kind of sucks, to be honest. It's not fun." Um, and somehow I managed to get like 2 months, and then she and I were having this conversation, and I kept on hearing how different of a person she was, and seeing how, um, I guess overworking in restaurants, you get to see a lot of people. You get to see a lot of people being successful wherever they are, whether they're servers, dish stewards, or managers, chefs. You get to see a lot of people in varying degrees of success and failure. Um, and she was clearly winning at life, like just
That's
winning
awesome.
at life. And I was like, wow, like I'd like to kind of have that. I'd like to have that stability, and like, I don't see how you're doing this. I don't see how you're enjoying it, because anytime I stop drinking, life sucks. Um, it sucks worse than when I was drinking, and I know it gets pretty bad when I drink. Um, the thing is, I stopped drinking, and then Thanksgiving happens, right? Um, Families coming. We all go back to our hometown 2 hours away, and I'm like planning. I've planned this awesome wine pick for all of us, like 5 people. Um,
Hmm.
I picked 18 different wines, and I put a lot of work into it. I was like, I'm not going to drink. Like, I'm sober. I've got 2 months sobriety. I can go into Thanksgiving and be fine. And my brother came to pick me up, and I don't know. 2 days in, I'd finished like 9 bottles by myself. Like, nobody else had touched it. And that was Thanksgiving of 2017, and I basically didn't stop drinking until like January or something again. Um, and again, my coworker kept on talking to me. We were really dead, super slow at this restaurant where I was working. Um, in the winter, it's slow. Everybody stays home. It's an outside space, and it gets cold here, so it was just dead. And we would just be talking, and I would be like, "Okay, yeah, sobriety. I'll try it out this time." And January, February, I get another like few days in sober, and a couple months sober, and then April, my birthday month comes, and again I drink, and I text an ex, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm not over this. I have so much work to do. I have so much work to do. If I have to stop drinking, I have to get over whatever it is that's keeping me from accessing. from accessing sobriety, I have to figure out what that is. And
Yeah.
I drank really hard for a couple weeks, and I woke up one day in May and realized that I was hallucinating. Um, Realized that these hangovers that I've been having were actually withdrawals, and like the hands shaking, and like my hangovers didn't kick in usually until 9 p.m. Just like just to give you a scale, it was just nutty.
Mm.
The withdrawals wouldn't
Wow.
kick in until 9 p.m. and I realized that all my actions had led me to withdrawals, and that it wasn't going to just stop. I wasn't just going to age out. I was 30, 31. I turned 31 in April, and I realized I wasn't just going to age out of drinking. I had to make the decision to stop. I had to take responsibility and face what I was deathly afraid of, which were my feelings. Um,
Yeah.
and I texted, I went on psychologytoday.com and I looked up a therapist who was an immigrant and non-religious, and I sent her an email. I was like, when can you meet? She's like, meet me in a week. I was like, okay, I guess that gives me a week head start to try. um, I found a general practitioner, a doctor, and somehow was able to get an appointment that week, which is just wild. Like, that doesn't happen. And I was like, hey, I went in and we did, I guess I was a week sober, or I don't know, 2 days sober. It's really fuzzy looking back. And I was like, hey, I've been drinking a lot. Like, we need to run a liver test. And all the tests came out fine, which is just wild to me. How do you drink that
Mm.
much for so long and just be okay? And I was like, so can you help me, doctor, with what's the solution? Like, how do I not drink? And he's like, have you tried AA? And I was like, I've been. It's not going to work for me. It's that's the last thing I want to hear you say. And
Yeah.
I moved on, and I went to that therapist, and I managed to stay sober for a week. Um, and she told me, "Hey, if you drink again, I'm going to send you to rehab." And just like that relationship that ended, I was like, "No, you're not sending me to rehab. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to get sober, and we're going to work through whatever it is I have to work through." Because this is not drinking
Mm.
is not working for me. I'm done. Um, and she told me to go to AA, and I didn't want to go. I was like, whatever it is that they're offering, I don't see how they're doing it. I don't see how all these people can go and be sober and be happy. Like, I just don't see how that's possible. Um, and it took me 2 months. I had 2 months of no drinking. I was locking myself in my office at work because I was too scared to drive home. I was too scared to pass the bars on the way home, and
Yeah.
I would drink coffee and throw up because at least that's better than and stay up all night. And the next morning, my team would come in to open at 11 a.m. and I'd be there, and they're like, "Why are you here? You were closing last night." And I was like, I don't know, man. I was just doing inventory. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And that was like 2 months, 3 months in, and finally, I was like, okay, maybe I'll go to AA and maybe things will be different. At the insistence of my therapist, and I went. Um, and the first thing I noticed was the shame that I felt towards myself and the anger that I felt towards sobriety in general. I was like, I don't want to be sober. Like, I don't want to be. I want to be fucked up all the time as much as I can. Um, and I felt so ashamed that I thought that, and that there was no cure for me, and that there is no way that anybody could relate that I needed help. Like, that was the lowest of the low, that I need help. Um, and instead, what I found was that people were relating to me. I would vent
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, and they would relate. And I found a lot of love from complete strangers, which just baffled me. I was like, how can you feel love for a stranger? How could you care at all about sobriety for this person who doesn't know how to live sober? And I found sober bartenders, and I found so many sober people that had like normal service industry lives, and they were staying sober. I was like, this is pretty cool, man. Um,
Mm.
and somehow I kept on going back because I found people I could relate to. And that actually led me to Ben's friends. Somebody uh, was like, "Oh, hey, there's this organization over in Charleston, South Carolina, that's called Ben's Friends, and it's a bunch of sober people in the industry. How cool would it be to have a meeting here in Louisville?" And I was about a year and a half sober at that point. Somehow I stayed sober, and I was like, "Yeah, that'd be pretty cool." So that person put me in touch with the co-founders. Um, and that was 2019, August of 2019, and we met in December of 2019, and then we opened our chapter here in Louisville in February of 2020.
Mm.
Um, and it turned out that,
Good timing.
yeah, great, perfect timing. Timing, yeah, timing is everything.
Yeah.
And then what happened was we had our in-person meetings like three times maybe, and then the group is based in Charleston, and we were the 13th city to open at the time. And we decided as a collective to start doing Zoom meetings so anybody nationally could join from the convenience of a
Okay.
phone or a computer. Everybody's restaurants were shut down, and we started meeting just every day at 1 p.m. Eastern. And then um, it was really intimidating meeting like celebrity chefs who were sober. At least it was for
Mm.
me. But being able to share the fear that we had in 2020 is nothing seemed to be going right. Everything seemed to be going wrong, but at least we had some sobriety. Um, and we stayed connected. And my relationship with Ben's friends has totally changed in a good way. The Louisville chapter has stayed active. We kept Zoom meetings going, and eventually we came back to in person. And I've grown to help out more and more in the online community that we've grown. We went from having just 7 meetings a day or 7 meetings a week with one a day to having, gosh, close to 17 meetings a week. And now we
Oh.
have 20, 20, maybe 22 chapters in person. Um, and it's just really cool to see how I could go from being a hopeless drinker, really, to somebody that can provide hope at all, to provide hope that there is a way to stay sober while working in the industry. And I did that all while staying at that job as a at a bourbon bar. So it's like playing on hard mode, but
Yeah.
things changed whenever I found my people. The sober bartenders, sober servers, absolute sober chefs, totally changed how I looked at things. It went from being alcohol is the problem, my liquor closet is a problem, to how I see things as a problem. And
Mm.
I wanted to be able to stop justifying all my lies. Um, and I wanted to stop the lies to myself and to other people because it wasn't serving me. I saw where it brought me, um, and it took being around other people who get it in a very real way, get the stress like of working 40 hours in 3 days when everybody else is having fun, um, and still going back for more. It took being around those people who get it and want it for me to want it and to understand it. And it's a continual conversation. I think that's a beautiful thing about recovery is that it's not it's not something I do in a vacuum. I don't just stay
Yeah.
sober in my room. Um, I do it. I stay sober day by day by talking about what's on my mind, listening to other people who talk about what they have on their minds, and not necessarily figuring it out, but talking about it really helps. It turns out, like actually learning, it's taught me about myself. And the sobriety I have today is not the sobriety I had a year ago, and it's not the
Yeah.
sobriety I had 5 years ago or 6 years ago, and it's something I'm really grateful for. Um,
Well,
and being around newcomers helps a lot too because the freshness disappears. The desperation, like my desperation, eventually went away. I thought it wouldn't. I thought the cravings would stay. And they did. My cravings stayed for like 9 months, but that desperation eventually leaves. And hanging around newcomers helps me keep my cardinal uh, directions uh, aligned. Like it helps me realize, yeah, shit does get really bad. It can get really bad. It does get really bad, and it will if I go back. Otherwise, I thought I would have drank by now. It's really bonkers to me that my sobriety date is May 10th of 2018, so 6.5 years. I don't know. I really would have thought I would have given up sobriety by month 4. I really thought I would have, but it
Mm.
took me seeing people succeed for me to see it as reachable for me, and in turn, I get to do that for other people and do that with other people.
Mm. I love that. I mean, first of all, thank you so much. I didn't even want to interrupt you in the least over the last, little bit of your story, just because I mean, I think it's so impactful. And for someone who, as I mentioned, had spent so much time in that industry, I just understand the challenges of trying to extract yourself from it when, and I don't want to put it on the industry necessarily, right? But like, it's just really hard to remove yourself from the place where you're perpetually getting sick, and to have examples for yourself, and then in turn to be that light and that leadership for others who are stepping into it for the first time. I feel like that's incredibly impactful and incredibly powerful. So I just hats off to you, just for yourself, but also in terms of what you're able to do for other folks in your community.
Thank you, Ray. And one thing I want to mention too is that as bartenders, as managers, we're on the cutting edge of culture. Like
Yeah,
we're the people come to have a good time. And how cool
yeah.
is it to influence culture at a not just a micro way, but in a macro way? Like we're seeing a movement of sober bartenders and sober people in general. And it's really cool to be part of that as a creative process. And it's really cool to see those conversations happen because we choose to do that. Um, and it is hard to get out of the industry, but it's a challenge worth seeking, and it's a life worth having. And that's one thing I think is really important to get at a very basic level. It's the life. Uh, my therapist told me this. And it totally changed the way I saw things because I had a big deal with higher power and all that. And one thing I learned is one thing she said is, "What if the world needs you sober?" And I was like, "That's a
Mm,
ludicrous question. I love it. What if the world needs me sober?" And suddenly,
that's awesome.
my recovery is answering that. Um, because I don't think one has to do anything super novel to make a difference in the world. I can be where I am, as I am, changing and make a difference. And that's really what Ben's Friends Hope is about. And that's what my recovery has become. Instead of giving in to this conspiracy of the world, of the industry, if there is one, to keep me drinking, it's learning to collaborate to stay sober.
I love it. I love it. So you guys have 22 chapters now with Ben's Friends. How many active members, roughly, would you say are part of this? And I don't think you had mentioned, when did Ben's Friends come into when was the inception of Ben Friends? How long has it been around?
Yeah, Ben's Friends started in 2016. The organization
Okay.
is named after Chef Ben Murray, who passed away while helping open a restaurant, and ultimately he killed himself through his addiction. And the
Mm,
co-founders were just despondent over the destruction that alcohol and addiction brings. It was one of the co-founders that he was working for, Steve Palmer, and Mickey Bax and Steve Palmer are the co-founders, and they were just over how destructive our industry can be. Chef Ben worked with a number of sober people at that restaurant, and still the topic of
hmm
sobriety and his challenges weren't easy to get out. And that's the thing. It's not easy to talk about. It's not easy to talk about addiction. It's not easy to talk about struggle. Um, I think that's the
Yep.
key point. When I was in the thick of it, I didn't really want to talk about it. I just knew I was in pain, and I knew what to do. Um, so Ben's Friends is about welcoming people who are questioning what addiction uh, is looking like in their lives and what they can do uh, to break free of that. And it's a continual conversation. And as far as members go, um, in our online meetings have grown. We were a small bunch in 2020. We had like 13 people showing up to meetings back then. And now we
Mm.
have sometimes meetings with 50 people on Zoom all at the same time. Sometimes 30, sometimes 20. We have a femmes and a men's meeting. So those two meetings tend to be a little bit smaller, which is really cool for an intimate
Okay.
conversation. As far as in-person chapters go, um, it's I haven't been to every chapter across the nation. I would say that it really depends. Some of our chapters have maybe 10, anywhere between like 8 and 10 people show up regularly. And then some chapters will have 20 to 30 people that show up in their city. So it's definitely a growing movement. We're definitely uh, uh, fostering a community that cares about each other. I can definitely say that we care about each other in a way that service people, hospitality people can. And that cross section of sobriety and hospitality definitely fosters a bond of being in the trenches, if it were, that
Yep.
is unlike anything else. We're already an island of misfit toys in the hospitality, but added sobriety,
Yeah.
and it's a real party. Not despair. It's a real party. And
I love that.
it's it's a pretty cool thing, and we're always open to growing. So if you're out there and you're listening, and you'd like to explore what it's like to open a chapter of Ben's Friends in your city or in your neighborhood, you can check us out at bensfriendshope.com. Um, and you can reach out. We have a way you can reach out through email. My number's on there. My email's on there as well. Um, we have a list of meetings in person and online on the website as well, so you can also just check us out. You can walk in. You don't have to be. Um, you can be sober curious. You don't have to be like an actively sober trademark person to come. You can be where you are, and I think that's one thing that's really encouraging is being able to come as I am. I can be upset
Mm.
and hungover, terrified about the next service I have to go into, or I can be. We have late night meetings, so I can be like riding the high of working a really busy bar shift and logging in and get centered for the rest of my night. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty cool opportunity to share with others.
I love all of it, and I'll certainly ensure that we include all of those links in the show notes for sure. I'm just thinking back to just you know all of my days, early mornings, late nights, because at a certain point I transitioned away from restaurants into hotels, and that is just kind of it's a beast in its own, where you're in the trenches at 6 o'clock in the morning, in the weeds from a breakfast rush, or you might be in the weeds at a PM event. And you mentioned earlier that it's not really something that we talk about so very openly in our industry, and I think it's particularly suited that way because it's just a really hard industry, generally speaking, to be in. The industry itself takes a toll, and for that reason I feel like folks are almost on they're walking this like plank of like being fortified, when in fact we're, to your point, the band of misfits running around who have like chinks in our emotional armor, and we're super sensitive, and we're super, we've been beat down over the course of life, and we're prone to a lot of these substances as coping mechanisms. And I think that's partially why we don't talk about it as well. So I love the fact that you've brought this to the Stack and Days podcast. I haven't spoken to anybody else from Ben's Friends, so thank you for that. And for anybody who's out there who's in the industry, who's looking for a space that is a safe place to land, please, take a look at Ben's Friends. It seems like they're doing some fantastic work.
Thank you so much for having me.
And No, you got it, Andrew. As I kind of get you out of here, I have two questions for you, and one is a quick kind of fastball. The other one's a little bit more of a lob for folks who are listening. So my first question is, in those days where you were probably struggling more than others, in your darkest moments, how would the folks around you have known that without you explicitly telling them? Like, so for example, the young lady who was your colleague, and you ended up having that dialogue around counting your drinks. Sounds like the first time, maybe where you were like forthcoming about where you were kind of were at in your journey. How would someone have known that you were struggling if that moment never happened?
Um, if some, gosh, somebody probably would have noticed me drinking at work at some point. And I feel like when somebody catches you, uh, or if you catch somebody, chances are it's been pretty bad for a while. Um,
Yeah,
so I would say when things notice to look bad, they're probably worse than they look. And if somebody were to ask me, people have asked me, "How are you doing?" Um, it's easy for me to brush off, "Oh, I'm doing fine." Um, I feel like it's kind of a learned art in asking for help. Um, it's a two-way
yeah,
street, and I feel like if other people were really wanting to help, um, being a little bit more probing, don't feel shy because it is an awkward situation overall. Um, and
yeah,
honestly, I feel like if people noticed me, I would be coming in later than usual. Um, I would be drinking at work. I would be smelling like work, like alcohol. Um, and goodness, it's tough. It's a tough road. Um, I feel
yeah,
like people didn't see the cracks forming underneath the facade because in hospitality it is all about presentation. So really noticing it takes really knowing somebody to see how their eyes look, how they're speaking, how they're holding themselves, how they're walking into work, how they're not showing up. I feel like that's a big thing. Um,
yeah,
when duties start to fall to the side, and accountability starts becoming less and less of a thing, I think that's a telltale sign that addiction is in full swing. Because I didn't feel capable of dealing with anything else when I was at my worst. Somehow, some days I was able to show up, but I think the biggest tell for me was when I was feeling like defensive. If I was feeling
yeah,
defensive, then that was a good sign.
yeah. I feel like you're not alone in that. I think defensiveness, trying to protect one's facade, is certainly a common thread. Um, Last question for you, for someone who's sitting there and maybe they're sober curious, maybe they're kind of in the later stages of reconciling their own relationship with alcohol, but they don't necessarily know what their first step could be to moving in a different direction. What would you suggest to that person?
The first step, I feel for me was awareness. Um, I knew that I didn't feel good when I drank. Like I knew when I drank, I wanted to be not drunk. I wanted to be somewhat sober. And I knew that whenever I was sober, I wanted to be drunk. Um,
Mm,
so that awareness of not wanting to be wherever I was a huge thing. And it really
mm,
spurred action in the right direction. So if you feel like something is not quite right, it's not quite right. Listen to your gut. Any time to change is a good time to change. And sticking to that change is going to be hard by yourself. It was
mm.
close. It was impossible for me to do it by myself. It just was. I thought I could self help myself out of it, and it wasn't until I involved other people that my problem became real and it became addressable. Um,
Right.
yeah, yeah, involving others, reaching out. It's a huge step in the right direction. It takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot. And I want to say that if you're strong enough to be in addiction, you're probably strong enough to be in recovery.
Mm. Mm. I love that. I love that. Andry, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. I'm sure that there's folks out there that are going to, learn a ton from your experience and your journey. So thank you. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you for this avenue for people to listen in. It's so cool seeing your podcasts grow and seeing you after listening for several weeks now.
Cool. Well, hopefully there's more to come, and we can continue to make an impact and give folks something to listen to and provide some light. So thank you for your contribution, and to everyone out there who's listening, appreciate y'all tuning in. We'll be back next week with another impactful journey of sobriety from within our community. So thank you very much. Peace. I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way, you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices in healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.